Welcome back to Revenge Stories family. I'm Diane, and tonight I want to tell you about the Thanksgiving dinner that changed the way my entire family saw me the night my brother made one comment too many, and I finally told the truth I'd been hiding for 15 years. If you've ever felt underestimated by your own family, stay with me, this one's for you. There's a particular kind of tiredness that comes from sitting in the same chair at the same table for 30 years listening to the same jokes made at your expense, dressed up in different words, but always landing in the same place. That was me every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every birthday dinner since I was 22 years old. The chair closest to the kitchen door so I could help mom with the dishes. The seat where nobody expected much from me and where over time I stopped expecting much from myself either. My name is Diane. I'm 54 years old, and for most of my adult life I have been the quiet disappointment of my family. It didn't start out that way. Not exactly. When I was a kid, I was the one who read too much, who asked too many questions, who wanted to take things apart just to see how they worked. My father used to call me the little engineer because I'd spend hours with a screwdriver and an old radio trying to figure out why the sound crackled. My mother liked that story. She told it at parties. Back then, I think she was proud of it. Things changed when I was 19. I dropped out of college in my second year, not because I failed, but because the tuition bills were crushing my parents and my brother Ryan was starting his freshman year the same semester. There wasn't enough for both of us, not without loans that terrified my father who had grown up watching his own parents drown in debt. So I made a choice. I told them I wanted to take a break, find myself work for a while. Nobody stopped me. Nobody really asked why either. Ryan finished his degree in business administration 4 years later. He got a job at a regional bank, the kind with a name everyone in town recognized, and from that day forward, he became the family's proof of concept, proof that if you did things the right way, the traditional way, you'd end up fine. Steady job, steady paycheck, steady life. I became the control group. The example of what happens when you don't. For the next 15 years, I moved through a series of jobs that never sounded impressive at a dinner table. Receptionist at a property management office. Assistant to a leasing agent, a stint doing data entry for a real estate firm that specialized in low-income housing renovations. None of it sounded like a career. It sounded like drifting. And my family treated it that way. Still doing the apartment thing, my mother would ask in a tone that made it sound like a phase I should have grown out of by 30. Still renting your place downtown? Ryan would ask every single year like clockwork, like he was checking a box on some invisible scorecard he kept just for me. I always answered the same way. Yep, still renting. Because it was easier than explaining. Because the truth, if I'd told it back then, would have sounded like a lie. A story too strange for anyone to believe coming from someone they'd already decided was falling behind. Here's what nobody in my family knew while they were building their story about who I was. I was quietly building something else entirely. It started small. In my late 20s, working at that property management office, I learned everything I could about the business. Not because I had some grand plan, but because I was curious the same way I used to take apart radios as a kid. I wanted to understand how buildings worked, how money moved through walls and roofs and heating systems, how a piece of real estate went from a liability to an asset in the right hands. I saved money in a way that would have seemed almost embarrassing to my family if they'd known. I drove a car until it had 240,000 miles on it. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a hardware store for 9 years, paying less in rent than what Ryan spent on his car payment alone, while my brother traded up a bigger house, a nicer truck, a country club membership he only used twice a year. I was quietly funneling every spare dollar into a savings account that nobody else knew existed. At 31, I bought my first property. It wasn't glamorous. A run-down duplex on the edge of town, the kind of building most people wouldn't look at twice. I fixed it up on weekends, learned to patch drywall and regrout tile from YouTube videos, rented out one half while living in the other. I told my family I was renting a place with a roommate situation. That wasn't exactly a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. Nobody asked follow-up questions. Nobody was curious enough to dig deeper. And somewhere in there, I realized something important: my family's low expectations of me had become, without them ever intending it, a kind of camouflage. As long as they believed I was still figuring things out, nobody paid close enough attention to notice what I was actually building. By 38, I owned 3 properties. By 45, 12. I won't pretend it was easy. There were years when I nearly lost everything during downturns nights. I sat at my kitchen table doing math until 2 in the morning, terrified I'd made a mistake I couldn't undo. But I kept going because somewhere along the way, this had stopped being about proving anything to my family. It had become mine. Something I had built with my own hands out of nothing while nobody was watching. And still, every holiday I sat in that same chair by the kitchen door and let them believe whatever story was easiest for them to tell. This particular Thanksgiving, though, something in me had shifted. I'd spent the morning finalizing paperwork on my newest acquisition, a mixed-use building downtown, the kind with restaurants on the ground floor and apartments above. It had taken almost a year to close the deal. I hadn't told anyone. I was going to eventually when it felt right. I just didn't know that eventually was going to arrive at my mother's dinner table in front of everyone, forced out of me by my brother's smirk. I drove to my parents' house with a pie I'd baked myself, the same pumpkin recipe I made every year, and I told myself the way I always did that this year might be different. That maybe for once nobody would need to make a comment. I should have known better by now. The house smelled like it always did on Thanksgiving turkey cinnamon, the particular mustiness of the good china coming out of the cabinet where it lived the other 360 days of the year. My mother had the table set the way she always set it here at the head. My father's old chair left empty since he passed 6 years ago, Ryan and his wife Karen across from me, Aunt Carol down at the far end, and me in my usual spot by the kitchen door. Dinner started the way it always did. Small talk, Karen showing off photos from a trip to the Bahamas. Ryan mentioning not for the first time that he'd just gotten a bonus at the bank, big enough to finally redo the kitchen. My mother beaming at him the way she always did, like his every achievement was a personal victory for her. Nobody asked me much of anything. That wasn't new. I'd learned over the years to fill my plate and let the conversation orbit around everyone else. It used to sting. By now, it mostly just felt familiar, the way an old ache in your knee feels familiar on a rainy day. Not exactly comfortable, but not surprising either. It was somewhere around the second helping of stuffing when Ryan turned to me, that particular smirk on his face that I'd come to recognize from 30 years of practice. It was the smirk that meant he'd thought of something clever to say and couldn't wait to say it in front of an audience. "So, Diane," he said loud enough that the whole table quieted to listen the way people do when they sense a performance is about to begin. "You still renting that place downtown at your age?" He said, "at your age," the way you'd say it about a person who'd been diagnosed with something chronic. Sympathetic on the surface, cruel underneath. "Must be rough," he added, shaking his head slightly like he was truly deeply concerned for my well-being. "I mean, 54 and still writing a rent check every month. That can't feel great." The table laughed. Not a big laugh, the kind of soft, knowing chuckle that ripples around a table when everyone silently agrees with the joke being made, even if nobody says so outright. Karen smiled into her wine glass. Aunt Carol let out an awkward little "Oh, Ryan," the kind of protest that isn't really a protest at all. I felt my face go warm, the old familiar heat of being the punchline again. For a second, I was 19 years old again, watching my parents write a tuition check for my brother instead of me. For a second, I was 30 years old again, hearing "still renting" for the first of what would become hundreds of times. My mother, sensing the way mothers always sense that something needed smoothing over, reached across the table and patted my hand. Her rings were cold against my skin, the same wedding band and sapphire ring she'd worn my entire life. "Oh, he's just teasing, dear," she said in that soft, practiced voice she used whenever she wanted a subject closed without actually resolving anything. "You know how he is." I did know how he was. That was exactly the problem. For a moment, I almost let it go the way I always had. I almost smiled, made some self-deprecating joke about how renting kept things simple, no maintenance headaches, no property taxes to worry about. That was the script. That was the role I'd played at this table for 3 decades, the good sport, the one who could take a joke, the one who never rocked the boat. But something in me this particular year, this particular moment, refused to play the part one more time. Maybe it was the exhaustion of watching my brother's smugness go unchecked for so many years. Maybe it was the memory of all those nights doing math at my kitchen table, all those weekends learning to patch drywall with my own hands, all those years of silence I'd kept out of some misguided instinct to avoid conflict. Maybe it was simply that I was tired in the deep cellular way that comes from carrying something heavy for far too long. I set down my fork. Slowly, deliberately, the way you set something down when you want the sound of it hitting the table to mean something. The table's chatter, which had already started drifting back to Karen's Bahamas photos, went quiet again. Something in the way I moved, I think, signaled that I wasn't finished. Ryan was still smirking, oblivious, reaching for another helping of mashed potatoes, clearly already savoring what he thought had been a successful little jab. My mother was watching me with the mild, hopeful expression of someone waiting for the good sport to resurface and laugh it off. I looked at Ryan. I looked at my mother. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let myself say the truth out loud at that table in front of everyone. Actually, I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, I own the building he rents in. For a moment, nobody understood what I'd said. That's the strange thing about a sentence that shatters a story someone has believed for 30 years. It doesn't land immediately. There's a delay, like the sound of thunder arriving seconds after the lightning. Ryan's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Karen blinked. My mother's hand, still resting on mine from her earlier gesture of comfort, went still. "What?" Ryan said, the smirk faltering, replaced by something between confusion and the beginning of alarm. "The building on 5th and Main," I said, keeping my voice calm, almost conversational, the way you'd mention the weather. "The one with the coffee shop on the ground floor. Your apartment is on the 3rd floor, unit 3B, isn't it? I closed on that building 14 months ago." I watched the words land on him in slow motion. First confusion, then disbelief, the kind that makes a person start searching your face for the joke, for the punchline, for some sign that you're about to laugh and say, "Just kidding." When he didn't find one, his expression shifted into something rawer, something that looked for just a second like fear. "That's..." he started, then stopped. "That's not possible. The building's owned by some management company. Silverline Properties or something. I've paid rent to them for 2 years. Silverline Holdings," I corrected gently. "It's mine. I formed it 4 years ago when I bought my first commercial property. I use it to hold the buildings, so I don't have to put my personal name on every lease. It's a fairly standard thing to do, actually, in this business." "In this business," Ryan repeated, like the words themselves tasted strange in his mouth. "What business? You've been renting a 1-bedroom apartment for as long as I can remember." "I've been renting a 1-bedroom apartment," I said, "because I chose to keep my personal expenses low while I reinvested everything else into acquiring properties. It's called leveraging your position. You'd know that, actually, working at the bank. You've probably approved loans for people doing exactly what I've been doing for years without realizing your own sister was one of them." The silence at the table had a texture to it now, thick and uncomfortable, the kind of silence that makes people shift in their seats and avoid each other's eyes. Karen had gone very pale, staring down at her plate like she was trying to disappear into the tablecloth. Aunt Carol, down at the far end of the table, had gone very still, watching everything unfold with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not shock exactly, more like she was recalculating something in her head. My mother was the one who broke first. Her hand, still resting on mine, tightened slightly, and when she spoke, her voice had lost its earlier soft, smoothing-over quality. "Diane," she said, "is this true? You own buildings, plural?" 12, I said. "Well, 13 now, counting the one on 5th and Main." I watched my mother's face do something I'd never seen it do before. Not in 54 years of being her daughter. It wasn't pride, not yet. It was something closer to disorientation. The look of a person who has just discovered that a map they've relied on for decades has been wrong the entire time. And now they don't know which direction is actually north. Ryan set his fork down. His face had gone from confusion to something tighter, more defensive, the particular flush of a man realizing in real time, in front of his wife and his mother and his aunt, that he had spent years mocking someone who could have bought and sold his entire life several times over without blinking. "Why didn't you say anything?" he demanded, and there was an edge to his voice now, something almost accusatory, as if my silence had been the real offense rather than his years of comments. I looked at him for a long moment before I answered. "Would it have mattered?" I asked quietly. "Would you have stopped if I'd told you 3 years ago, or 5 or 10? Or would you have found some other way to make me the joke at this table?" Nobody answered that. Nobody could. I picked my fork back up, cut a piece of turkey, and ate it in silence while around me the entire architecture of my family's assumptions slowly, quietly began to collapse. The silence at the table stretched long enough that I found myself drifting in my mind back through the 15 years that had led to this moment. The years nobody at that table had witnessed because nobody had thought to ask. It started with a job I almost didn't take. I was 26, working the front desk at a dentist's office, feeling like my life had stalled somewhere I hadn't meant to stop. A former coworker mentioned an opening at a small property management company. Nothing glamorous, just answering phones, scheduling maintenance calls, filing lease paperwork. I took it because it paid $2 more an hour than the dentist's office, and because honestly I didn't have anything better going on. I didn't know walking in that first day that I was walking into the thing that would define the rest of my life. The owner of that company was a woman named Patricia Reyes. Sharp-eyed, no-nonsense, somewhere in her 60s, who'd built the business herself after her husband left her with 2 kids and a mortgage in her 30s. She noticed within a few months that I asked more questions than the job required. Why did we structure this lease the way we did? Why did that building's insurance cost so much more than the 1-2 blocks over? What made one property a good investment and another a money pit? Most bosses would have found it annoying. Patricia found it useful. She started explaining things to me, not because she was required to, but because I think she recognized something in me that reminded her of herself at that age. She taught me how to read a rent roll, how to spot deferred maintenance that would come back to bite an owner in 5 years, how to calculate a cap rate, how financing worked, how the entire machinery of real estate investment operated beneath the surface of what most people saw as simply a place to live. Most people, she told me once over coffee in her cluttered back office, think buildings are about bricks and windows. They're not. Buildings are about numbers. Learn the numbers and you can own anything you want eventually. Nobody has to know you're doing it while you're doing it. I took that advice more literally than she probably intended. For the first few years, I simply saved. I lived far below what I could technically afford the way some people train for a marathon quietly, methodically, without announcing it to anyone. My 1-bedroom apartment above the hardware store cost me $410 a month, a rate I managed to keep frozen for nearly a decade by never complaining to my landlord about anything, fixing small things myself, being the kind of tenant a landlord never wants to lose. I drove a Honda Civic until the transmission finally gave out at 243,000 miles. I packed my lunch every day for work. I didn't take vacations, not real ones, the occasional weekend trip to visit a friend, nothing that required a plane ticket. Every dollar I didn't spend went into a savings account I'd opened specifically for what I in my own head called the plan, even though for the first several years I didn't fully know what the plan was. At 31, I had enough saved for a down payment on that first duplex, the rundown one on the edge of town that nobody else wanted. I remember standing in front of it the day I closed, looking at the peeling paint and the sagging gutter, and feeling something I hadn't felt in years, the sense that I was building something that belonged entirely to me. Something nobody had given me. Something nobody could take away. I did the renovation work myself mostly. Weekends spent covered in drywall dust. Evenings spent watching tutorial videos about grouting tile and rewiring outlets. I made mistakes, plenty of them. I flooded a bathroom once trying to replace a wax ring on a toilet and had to pay a plumber $400 to fix what should have taken me 20 minutes if I'd known what I was doing. I learned anyway. Every mistake was tuition in a school nobody else in my family had ever attended. 2 years later, I refinanced that duplex, pulled out the equity I'd built, and used it as the down payment on a small 4-unit building. 2 years after that, I did it again. Patricia, watching from the sidelines, eventually asked if I wanted to leave the property management company and go work for myself full-time. I said yes before she finished the question. There were terrifying years in there, 2 years I don't usually talk about even now. In my late 30s, right as I was scaling up faster than I probably should have, a downturn hit, and 2 of my properties sat half vacant for the better part of a year. I remember doing math at 2 in the morning at my kitchen table, staring at spreadsheets, genuinely afraid I was going to lose everything I'd built, that I'd have to go crawling back to my family and admit that my secret life had been a failure all along. I didn't sleep much that year. I aged, I think, more in those 12 months than in the 5 years before or after. But I didn't lose it. I cut costs, took a part-time consulting job on the side to cover the gap, negotiated with my lenders, and eventually the market turned, the vacancies filled, and I came out the other side of it with something I hadn't expected, not just more properties, but a kind of quiet, unshakable confidence that no comment at a dinner table could ever touch again. I had already survived worse than a smirk from my brother. I had survived doubting myself in the dark alone, with no one to reassure me and coming out the other side anyway. By the time I was 45, I had 12 properties under Silverline Holdings, a name I chose specifically because it revealed nothing about who I was. I liked it that way. I liked walking into my parents' house every holiday looking on paper exactly like the daughter they'd already decided I was the one who was still figuring things out, while privately holding a portfolio worth more than every asset my brother had ever bragged about combined. I want to be honest about something sitting there at that table watching my family absorb what I'd just told them. It wasn't only pride I felt remembering all of this. There was grief in it too. Grief for all the years I'd spent believing on some level that I needed to hide my success in order to be safe from their judgment. Grief for the version of myself who might have thrived even faster, might have felt less alone in the hard years, if even one person in my family had simply asked, with real curiosity, what I was actually doing with my life instead of deciding they already knew. But grief and pride can sit in the same chest at the same time. I'd learned that too somewhere along the way. Aunt Carol was the first to really speak after that long, heavy silence. "Diane," she said slowly, setting down her wine glass. "How long have you actually been doing this?" 15 years, I said, give or take. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though there wasn't much humor in it. 15 years. And none of us knew. None of you asked. I said, not unkindly, just factually. Every year somebody at this table asked me if I was still renting. Nobody ever asked what I actually did all day or what I was building or why. It's a lot easier to keep a secret when nobody's curious enough to find it. Ryan had gone quiet in a different way now. Not the stunned silence of a few minutes earlier, but something more sullen, more defensive, the posture of a man trying to figure out how to save face in front of his wife. "So what?" he said finally, a little too sharply. "You've just been sitting there every Thanksgiving letting us think you were struggling so you could feel superior about it later." I looked at him steadily. "No, Ryan. I never once felt superior sitting at this table. I felt small. Every single year. I let you all believe I was struggling because it was easier than defending myself against jokes I knew you were going to make regardless of what I said. If I'd told you 5 years ago that I owned 4 buildings, you'd have found some other way to needle me about it, too aggressive, too money-focused, not enough of a family person. There was no version of the truth that would have made you stop. So I stopped expecting it to." Karen, who had been silent this entire time, finally spoke, her voice small. "The building on 5th and Main," she said. "That's a beautiful building. We toured 3 places before we picked that one. The agent told us the owner was very selective about tenants." "I am," I said. "I read every application myself, still even now. I liked your application for what it's worth. Good credit, stable income, no red flags. I approved it without knowing it was you two. If I had known, I probably would have felt strange about it, honestly. I'm glad I didn't." Karen looked for a moment like she might cry. "I think it wasn't about the money at all. I think it was the sudden, dizzying realization of how much of what she'd assumed about her own family had simply been wrong." My mother had been quiet for a long stretch, and when she finally spoke, her voice had a different quality to it than I'd heard from her in years smaller, more uncertain. "I always worried about you," she said. "Every year. I used to lie awake sometimes thinking about what would happen to you when you got older if you didn't have—" She gestured vaguely. "Stability. A house. Something to fall back on." "I understand that," I said, and I meant it. "I think you worried because you loved me in your own way. But I also think it was easier to worry about me than to actually ask me questions you might not have known how to hear the answers to. You built a story about me a long time ago, the one who didn't finish college, the one who never seemed to get her life together. And every year that story got repeated so many times it just became true as far as this family was concerned. Nobody checked if it still matched reality." My mother's eyes were wet now. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, and I don't think I'd heard her say those 2 words together sincerely more than a handful of times in my entire life. I don't know what else to say. I'm sorry, Diane." I reached over and took her hand, the same hand that had patted mine earlier in that practiced smoothing over gesture. This time it felt different. Less like a performance, more like an actual attempt to reach me. Aunt Carol cleared her throat. "You know," she said, looking around the table, "I think there's something else worth saying here. Diane's been quietly helping this family for years, and none of you noticed that either." I felt my face warm again, differently this time. "Carol." "No, let me say it," she said firmly. "When your roof needed replacing 2 years ago, Barbara," she nodded at my mother, You told everyone some contractor gave you a family discount. That was Diane. She paid for half of it and told the contractor not to mention her name. My mother's mouth opened slightly. She looked at me. It wasn't a big deal, I said quickly. I didn't want it to be a thing. And when Ryan's daughter needed help with her deposit for her first apartment last year, Carol continued undeterred, the family friend who co-signed for her so she didn't need a guarantor that was also Diane. Wasn't it? The table had gone quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the shocked silence of the secret exposed, but something gentler, sadder. The quiet of a family realizing how much love had been moving through their lives unacknowledged for years. Ryan looked at me, and for the first time all evening, the smirk was entirely gone from his face. What replaced it looked almost like shame. I didn't know that was you, he said quietly. Sarah never said. I asked her not to, I said. It wasn't about getting credit, I just wanted to help. He was quiet for a long moment, turning his fork over in his fingers. I've spent 30 years thinking I was the one who had it figured out, he said finally, more to himself than to me. And you've been quietly taking care of all of us this whole time. I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't really anything left to say. Sometimes the truth just needs room to sit in a room without anyone rushing to fill the silence around it. Dinner ended differently than it usually did. There was no dramatic blow-up, no tearful movie-style reconciliation where everyone hugged and promised to be better. Real families rarely resolve themselves that cleanly, and mine certainly didn't. But something had shifted quietly in the room the way weather shifts before you can quite name the change. A different pressure in the air, a different quality of light. My mother helped me clear the table afterwards, something she hadn't done in years, always having left that task wordlessly to me. We stood at the sink together, her washing me drying the way we used to when I was a teenager, before the story about who I was had calcified into something neither of us questioned anymore. 12 buildings, she said at one point, almost to herself, staring out the window over the sink. I don't think I ever really saw you, Diane. Not really, not for a long time. You're seeing me now, I said, and I meant it as something closer to an offering than a criticism. She nodded slowly and didn't say anything else, but she reached over and squeezed my hand once tightly before going back to the dishes. It wasn't everything. It wasn't going to undo 30 years of comments made at that table. But it was something, and I found that I was willing finally to let it be enough for now. Ryan caught me in the driveway as I was leaving, keys in hand, the cold November air sharp against my face. Hey, he said, hands jammed in his jacket pockets, looking younger somehow than he had all evening, less like the man who'd smirked across the table, and more like the little brother I remembered from decades ago before either of us had built the separate lives that had somehow ended up so far apart. I'm sorry. For tonight. For a lot of nights probably, if I'm being honest. I know, I said. I don't really know what to do with all this, he admitted. Finding out my sister's been quietly this successful the whole time I was making jokes about her rent. I considered him for a moment in the porch light. You don't have to do anything with it, I said. You don't owe me some big gesture, just maybe next year ask me a real question instead of making a joke. That's really all I ever wanted, honestly. Not an apology, just curiosity. He nodded slowly and I saw something settle in his face. Not quite resolved, but at least honestly considered. I drove home that night along the river road, the city lights starting to flicker on against the early dark of late November. I didn't feel triumphant exactly the way you might expect after finally saying the thing you'd swallowed for 30 years. I felt something quieter than that. Something closer to relief. I thought about Patricia Reyes, the woman who'd taught me to read a rent roll all those years ago, who'd once told me that most people think buildings are about bricks and windows when really they're about numbers, about patience, about being willing to do the quiet work nobody's watching. I thought about all those nights at my kitchen table doing math by lamplight, terrified and determined in equal measure. I thought about the one-bedroom apartment above the hardware store, the $410 a month, the years of packed lunches and secondhand furniture that had built slowly, invisibly into something real. I didn't need my family's approval to know what I'd built was valuable. I'd known that for years, quietly on my own. But there was something undeniably good about finally letting them see it too. Not because I needed the validation, but because carrying a secret for that long, even a secret you're proud of, is its own kind of tiredness. It felt good, finally, to set that particular weight down. I turned onto 5th and Main a few minutes later, not because I needed to, My apartment was in the opposite direction, but because some part of me wanted to see the building lit up against the night sky, the coffee shop below dark and closed for the holiday, the windows above glowing warm with the lives of the people who called it home, including 3 floors up my brother and his wife settling in after a Thanksgiving neither of us would forget. I sat there for a few minutes in my car engine idling, looking up at it. Mine, I thought. Built with my own 2 hands out of nothing while nobody was watching. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, that thought didn't feel like a secret I had to protect. It just felt like the truth, quiet, solid, and entirely finally mine to claim out loud.